Hello, my name is Ben Secor, and this is my presentation for the second Hegel Wiki for the Hegel seminar. This presentation is going to be on the term that Hegel uses, Entäußerung. That's probably pronounced very, very poorly. However, it's not as straightforward, in my opinion, as like the last phrase, the Cyclicite. So I'm going to try to use the original German word. There's an interesting discussion I kind of read where in a lot of texts, it's just kind of translated grossly to alienation. However, it's a little more than that, and it kind of relates directly to the self, as we're going to see in the upcoming things. So bear with me. There's going to be kind of just like the butchered German word throughout this whole thing, because it's not, in my opinion, it's not quite as simple as just a direct translation to a single English word. So for this presentation, we're going to be discussing roughly paragraphs 480 to about 595 in the 6th chapter of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. We're going to be looking at some key differences between Kant and Rousseau, because Hegel talks a lot about Rousseau's philosophy in this section, and also how that philosophy ties into the French Revolution, and then also the Reign of Terror that was kind of promulgated by the various political parties and the infighting between the two of them. And the political party that had kind of created a lot of the violence propagated during the Reign of Terror was the Montagnards, who were kind of a sect from the Jacobins, and they were avid followers of Rousseau, or at least in their opinion they were. And so we're going to kind of talk about where Hegel sees them going wrong. We're also going to have a discussion of the two types of Entäußerung that I feel like occur within this section. The first one is kind of Hegel will give an acceptance of Rousseau, however, based off of this kind of like Entäußerung that he thinks is prevalent in the ideal Kantian society. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And that's kind of the first like preliminary version of this Entäußerung. We're then going to go on to talk about how there's kind of this conflict between enlightenment and faith. And the Enlightenment leads to kind of a free society, and we're going to talk about more how it does that. It does that through this kind of like medium of religion. However, it applies to the society in a broader sense too, and does away with a lot of other kind of superstitions. We're going to kind of talk about how once people are freed from some of the things that Enlightenment seek to destroy, there's going to become like a degradation of this Rousseauian society that leads to the Reign of Terror. So we're going to kind of talk about how that happens in terms of the self and like the self-consciousness, and then how the spirit has to overcome that in order to kind of overcome like the hardships that occur in the Reign of Terror. And then finally we're going to piece together this Entäußerung, terror and death, meaning we're going to kind of tie it all together as it relates to the French Revolution. It sounds kind of dark, but I think at the end of this section Hegel's actually rather optimistic about the overcoming capabilities of the spirit. So let's begin. So this brief interpretation of Kant is going to be based off of Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, one of his novels, and then also on the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. So this first quote here: to evaluate ourselves, this ideal moral of perception, i.e. the archetype of moral attitude, in all its purity, is the universal human duty. So what Kant is kind of driving at here is that all humans have a duty to compare themselves to this like kind of like archetypal categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative, as I'm sure most people are used to, is there's several portions of it, but the most basic way to summarize it would be, unless your actions can be universalized to everybody and everybody does them all the time without an internal negation occurring within the action, then they're moral. And also that you're always to treat somebody as basically an end in themselves and not simply a mean to satisfy your own end. And then there's some slight nuances to it, but those are the two overarching things that you can kind of get away with if you're trying to do a rough sketch of Kant. And so that quote there is from the groundwork of the, oh no, that one's actually from, that was from A Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason. The other quote here too is also from Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason. One must have faith that there once was a human being who through his holiness and merit has enough of himself as well of all others in order to hope that even in a good way of life he can become blessed. And so what Kant is doing here is he's kind of humanizing this categorical imperative, which is one of his key tasks within Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, is he's trying to take this categorical imperative and apply it to kind of like the archetype of Jesus Christ and Christianity. And so Kant believes that this categorical imperative and the teachings of Christianity are pretty much objectively the best way to go. And we as humans can kind of tap into this through both the archetypes presented to us in Christianity, but they're founded in our rationality. So Kant also believes that, like I said, they're governed by the categories of categorical imperatives. Basically, like, he's drawing a difference here between a hypothetical imperative would be something like, oh, I'm going to act this way in order to get money. A categorical imperative is, I must act this way because it's the only rational way to basically act. And this is going to kind of lead Kant to this notion of a society where everybody kind of behaves the same and everything's pretty homogeneous, as we're going to talk about. And this is going to lead us to a form of kind of like alienation, or the Entäußerung that Hegel talks about, but it's a little bit of a weaker form. But we'll cover that in about 2 slides after we talk about Rousseau's general structure and morals, and also his general structure of how society should be ran. So, unlike Kant, Rousseau thought that there was forms of the Enlightenment that were actually kind of enslaving people. So the growth of cosmopolitanism, which is basically the increase of like industries, consumerism, arts, the fine cultures, leads people to value money. And then once somebody starts valuing money, a person loses his ability to have legitimate interpersonal relationships. And this is where Rousseau and also Hegel, we'll talk about this a little more on the next slide, but they're going to think Kant is going to force people into this kind of Entäußerung, where because people are kind of being governed from the top down by these like objective truisms and objective beliefs, it's going to lead necessarily to this kind of form of cosmopolitanism. And Kant actually thought this was a good thing and a necessary thing. He thought that if everybody was kind of homogeneously being controlled by the categorical imperative, and we all value the same archetypes, and we all live our lives according to these rational means, then naturally this kind of cosmopolitanism is going to sprout out. But Rousseau and Hegel kind of see this as like a force that's going to alienate the for itself, basically from like what people are kind of in themselves. And so what I mean by that is, in their personal life, in their own self-consciousness, they are never going to feel at home in the objective world around them. So the in itself of who somebody is to others and also to themselves in its totality will never quite match up with the for itself. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But Rousseau noticed this, and I think Hegel picks up on this, and he thinks that's a pretty interesting idea. So Rousseau didn't believe so much in this overarching categorical imperative. As we're going to talk about more, Rousseau has this notion of a universal will. And so Rousseau thinks that the universal will therefore accompany the will of all the citizens. And so he thinks, he would kind of look at Kant's notion and be like, well, that's okay, Kant, this whole top-down governance, but it's going to naturally lead to this Entäußerung, because people are going to say, well, my self-conscious life is so different than how I have to portray myself in the objective world. And so every relationship you have with people, your family, your friends, your neighbor, is going to be basically in accordance with this cosmopolitanism, which is fueled by monetary growth, power, money. So when you say, hi neighbor, how are you doing? Like, that whole act is basically just a big stage work in order to kind of obtain success and power to some extent, and obtain capital in order to basically enable this cosmopolitanism to spread and to further cause like a homogeneous nature around the planet that Kant thought was good. Kant thought it would be great if we had like a whole basically world of republics, and that everybody kind of believed the same thing, and we were really kind of in it for the trade, but everybody liked the same archetypes, maybe small differences, but the categorical imperative was followed to the T. Everybody should be fine, right? It's like rational for humans to do that. Rousseau attempts to basically put in a little bit more human freedom into his philosophy of how the world should be governed and also how government should work than simply following the categorical imperative, when he says that the universal will is what we have to follow. And we're going to talk more about that because Hegel goes in depth about that in this section. He's going to talk about the base units for the universal will, human freedom, and how it all ties in together. Building off what we just covered last slide, Hegel sides with Rousseau on the issue of cosmopolitanism and the illegitimacy of citizenship yielded within the ideal and liberal Kantian society. So meaning, within this kind of Kantian cosmopolitan society, nobody's a legitimate citizen. What that means is they're only a citizen insofar as they're enabled to live their kind of personal life, if that makes sense. They don't actually have any legitimate tie. They don't legitimately care for the broader society they're a part of, because the self-consciousness is so estranged and so different from the world around them and the world that the individual is in. This is the first example of this Entäußerung, where the individual does not feel at home. He doesn't feel at home within the world he lives in. Neither does he feel at home within the role he has to play within that world. So we have this quote from paragraph 498 of the 6th chapter, Phenomenology of Spirit, which goes, "Through the enjoyment of wealth, the individual does not experience his universal essence, but obtains only transitory consciousness and the enjoyment of himself as a singularity existing for itself, as well as the enjoyment of a non-identity with his essence, meaning his essence as citizen, as person in himself in society. He enjoys the non-identity of that. He doesn't identify with that. The thing that he does find enjoyment in is basically his severance from society, and the only way he's able to find pleasure is in this kind of self-consciousness, this transitory consciousness, as Hegel is going to call it. And so this is the first example of this Entäußerung. We go on to paragraph 505, where we have, "Nevertheless, through this estrangement is not yet a self-consciousness that knows itself to be state power." So what he's talking about there is basically the estrangement from the individual and the state that he lives in and the society he's a part of. The state doesn't realize quite yet that it has power over this individual. So it doesn't quite understand that yet. It doesn't have the consciousness that, oh, well, I'm ruling this land of individuals and I am in complete control over them. It doesn't realize that yet. And that's going to be a key thing that's going to lead to enlightenment thinking, as we're going to see. As I said, this is the first example of this Entäußerung discussed within the section. The individual is alienated from his essence by wealth. His essence, according to Hegel, is basically being kind of a part of the society you live in, playing an active role in the societal life you're a part of. The individual in this stage isn't seeking that. Instead, he's very, very content with a lot of the monetary possessions he has. Maybe he loves going to the theater and participating in the fine arts, which is all fine and good, but he's not in it for the state and the society he's a part of. He's in it purely for himself. And so, as I said, essence being reflective consciousness, constituting spirit, which is basically referring to the bullet point right above that. So when he says the individual is alienated from his essence, that essence is the reflective consciousness that constitutes spirit within the society. So as we talked about last presentation, remember that an individual's essence is basically to be a part of the spirit, and the spirit in the society is a self-reflecting kind of consciousness that's attempting to find out where it is and what it's doing. And so the individual who has been living in this cosmopolitan society, who is very has been taken over by kind of this commercialism, is not interested in being part of the spirit. He's not interested in tapping into his essence. He's much more interested in this, what he's the transitory consciousness and enjoyment of himself as a singularity. He doesn't want anything to do with the spirit. He doesn't want anything to do with the Geist, or basically this consciousness reflecting on the society that it lives in. He's much too content just living in his own kind of transitory existence. So now we come to Hegel's discussion of the Enlightenment, and he talks about enlightenment both being an escape from wealth and also an escape from the superstition tied to religion. And they both tie in, I think they tie in very nicely to one another, and I think that also insofar as the Enlightenment escapes the superstition tied to religion, it also seeks to escape from the control of wealth we just talked about that is kind of present in this cosmopolitan society. So we have this first quote in paragraph 548 that goes, "Thus, what pure insight pronounces to be its other, what it pronounces to be an error or a lie, can be nothing other than itself. It can only condemn what it is." And so that's Hegel talking about how at the heart of both the Enlightenment and religion there lies this thing called pure insight. And pure insight is going to be one of the key factors to allowing the self-consciousness to escape from wealth, and also for certain individuals to escape from the materialistic religious superstition. We have this next quote on paragraph 549 that goes, "Trust, however, is faith, because the consciousness of the believer is immediately connected with its object, and thus also intuits that the consciousness is one with it and in it." So the Enlightenment is attempting to disavow religion, but it only succeeds in dealing with the materially based superstition, because this whole faith and trust is very important to the pure insight. It kind of is one with it. It's one with the consciousness as well. So pure insight lies at the heart of both religion and Enlightenment thinking, which is the difficult part to kind of grasp. When he's talking about the pure insight that lies in the heart of religion, he's not talking about the physical things or necessarily even the historical events that led to the creation of the religion. What Hegel's talking about is this kind of like reflective consciousness that creates the religion. It's the same reflective consciousness that creates the Enlightenment. And what led to the creation of both the Enlightenment and religion is this pure insight. And so that's where Hegel talks about how the Enlightenment's going to try to attack religion, attack it, and it's going to do a good job of freeing it from the superstition, but it's never going to really destroy it, because the Enlightenment would basically be attempting to undermine itself, and Hegel doesn't think that's really possible. So we have this next quote on 557 that goes, "Reason, or pure insight, is not itself empty, since its negative is for it and is its content. On the contrary, it is rich, though only in singularity and limits, neither allowing such things." When he says things, he's talking about wealth or like religious superstition, these kind of material things that have like controlled the self-conscious and that are separate from pure insight, to come near it, the absolute essence, nor coupling with it the reason's enlightened way of life. So it is through separating religion from superstition that the Enlightenment can free itself. It can free its self-consciousness from wealth. And basically what happens is the Enlightenment, through destroying the superstition kind of found within religion, is also going to do away with the monetary beliefs that tied people to that Entäußerung that caused them to be estranged from the society. And then we're going to be led into people being able to have a much more legitimate sense of citizenship. And as we're going to see, that's going to become crucial to the French Revolution. And then we're also going to talk a little bit more now about the universal will. So now that the Enlightenment thinking has kind of taken hold and religious superstition has been done away with, and in theory also has the self, the transitory consciousness that Hegel talked about in the other quote, that simply values wealth and suffers like an Entäußerung from the broader society. We didn't return to kind of the state of nature that Rousseau thought would be necessary for us to escape this cosmopolitanism, but neither have we created the Kantian cosmopolitan society. And so I think I forgot to mention that Rousseau thought that in order to escape this cosmopolitanism of Kant, he suggested that we return slightly to the state of nature, meaning that we take a look at some of these modern structures and we do away with them. We're like, okay, we don't need as much of that. We don't need kids to be learning the arts as much as we do. We need kids to be doing more hard-working jobs. We need to go back to the state of nature in that respect, and that we kind of alienate ourselves from its arts a little bit. So we haven't gone there. That's not where we're at, and neither have we completely been engulfed in this cosmopolitan republic of Kant, in Hegel's opinion. So I think that Hegel believes that this escape that we've done from wealth leads man to being a useful tool. Oh man, a tool for what? A tool for what we're going to learn to be the universal will. So once man has escaped from wealth and also religious superstition, we're led with this quote from paragraph 560 that goes, "Just as everything is useful for man, so he is useful too, and his determination is just as much to make himself generally useful and a universally serviceable member of the troop." And so now we're already starting to kind of get into this man is a member of the universal will. We're starting to get into this talk a little bit with Hegel. And so he's echoing Rousseau in this, and we'll talk more about that. But it's clear from this section that man can only become useful in this sense once he's been cast out of the materialistic realm of superstition and wealth. So man has to overcome this initial Entäußerung. He has to basically stop valuing this transitory consciousness that he finds for itself and realize that he is a member of society. He's got to try to develop this kind of spiritual consciousness. And once he escapes from wealth and superstition, I think that Hegel believes that man will have accomplished this to the extent that allows for the creation of the universal will, as we'll talk about here soon. So we then go on to paragraph 579, where we have, "Nevertheless, usefulness is where pure insight completes its realization and becomes its own object." So as we talked about in the last section, this pure insight lies at both the heart of the Enlightenment and religious thinking, the more pure religious thinking that's freed from these materialistic values. So once pure insight emerges from the Enlightenment, the individual can become useful, and the individual is no longer going to be this transitory consciousness that simply values the basic hedonistic tendencies of cosmopolitanism, and nor does the individual simply rely on materialistic things about religion and superstition. The individual has now become useful, and what he's become useful for, we're going to talk about in the upcoming slides. So now, as I alluded to last time, we're going to be talking about what is the individual useful for, and this is one of my favorite quotes in this section here because it hints at the issue. I think Hegel's very clever for doing this, but this hints at the issue we're going to run into. So we have the quote that says, "Henceforth, spirit is present as absolute freedom. It is self-consciousness grasping itself, so that each always does everything undividedly, and what emerges as the deed of the whole is the immediate and conscious deed of somebody." Now, when I first read this, I had read it a couple times because I was like, that seems so contradictory. How does the absolute freedom lead everybody to act as the conscious deed of each somebody? And we're going to talk about that's where Rousseau is going to go terribly wrong, terribly wrong, and the Reign of Terror is going to come about. I just wanted to kind of preface that real quick because I think this is a very interesting quote. But so as we see here is that this freedom from wealth and both the superstition of religion is useful for this general will, the Rousseauian notion of a general will. The base unit for the general will is the will of each individual, so insofar as they're free. So it's the will of each free individual constitutes the general will. So much like if we are taking a measurement and the base unit is in centimeters, likewise, if we're measuring the general will, the base unit is the freedom of each individual. Now, hopefully you kind of got what I was alluding to, where that immediately seems like a contradiction. Immediately. And this is going to lead us to the more legitimate form of Entäußerung that Hegel is going to talk about with the Reign of Terror, and that's going to basically be the rest of the slides in this presentation, because I think it's very clever what Hegel talks about. But in general, just for this slide, the main point is it's important to know that in order for the Enlightenment to occur, in order for the general will to occur, the individual must be free from both religious superstition and wealth. They can't be a transitory consciousness that only values their self-consciousness separate from society. They need to have a sort of societal consciousness. They got to embody the kind of Hegelian notion of Geist. They got to be a self-reflecting consciousness, and that's what the Enlightenment is key for. It gets us there. And as we're going to see, this internal kind of negation I just pointed out is going to lead to the Reign of Terror and whatnot. That's the next couple of slides. It's also like noteworthy that wealth is still a factor for the life of an individual, but Hegel doesn't think that wealth leads to Entäußerung like it did in the beginning. It's no longer a force that's keeping people out of the public sphere, keeping people out of participating in society. I think part of this is also because the government has now realized, if you remember the last a couple slides ago, where we talked about how the government was not yet self-conscious that it has control over these individuals, but now it's starting to gain that consciousness. It's starting to gain a self-consciousness, and the people are also free, and they're supposedly playing a role in the self-consciousness of the government, because the freedom of the individual is the base unit for this general will. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about this, and also how this leads to the Reign of Terror. In paragraph 588, Hegel is going to now start making explicit what was implicit in that last quote that I said that I really liked. He's going to go on to say, for whatever the self is only represented and presented, like within the universal will, wherever it is delegated, it does not exist. So, and then he's going to follow that up in the next paragraph by saying, just as the singular self-consciousness does not find itself as existent substance in this universal work of absolute freedom, neither does it find itself in its will's own deeds and individual actions. So meaning that this self-consciousness that's now free is not going to find itself. It's going to find itself alienated from the general will. It's going to say, well, I'm a free individual that is somehow constituting this form of general will. So there's going to start to be cracks in the general will. There's going to be dissent. There's going to be differing opinions. And this is going to lead to the more potent version of Entäußerung, where now the human being is free, and his freedom supposedly constitutes the structure of general will. But because there's like an internal negation, the dialectic is going to pursue this kind of notion of this being a self-contradicting idea. There's going to be cracks in this general will because it's constituted as freedom. It's almost a self-negating proposition if you say there is a general will and it's composed by the freedom of all. that immediately struck me anyway as kind of contradictory. So there's a very problematic dialectic developing within the universal will as constituted by individual freedoms, and Hegel is going to begin to make this explicit at around paragraph 588 and also paragraph 589. It does not seem to be the case that the liberated self can remain free all the while serving as the base unit for the universal will. So like we said, it's a little bit contradictory that these freedoms are going to constitute the universal will, the general will, and we're going to see where that contradiction leads us. And this difference, this basically inability for the base unit of individual free will to constitute the universal will, is going to make this more potent version of Entäußerung that Hegel is going to talk about in the last portion of this section. Now we're led to finally terror, death, and Entäußerung, and when I say terror, it's a direct reference to the Reign of Terror that occurred in France, because that's clearly what Hegel is talking about in the section of the phenomenology of spirit. So because there is a contradiction in the notion that a free self can serve as a base unit for the universal will, we're then led to this quote on paragraph 590, the unique work indeed of universal freedom becomes death. What does that mean? That's a pretty drastic thing to claim there, Hegel. It cannot present itself any other way than faction, and what it is this universal freedom. So basically what Hegel's alluding to here is that the universal will can only come into actuality through government. So the Rousseauian notion of general will, universal will, is only put into action through government. And so the notion is that the universal will become the government, and then therefore all the laws passed will encompass the universal and general will of the people. However, as we talked about, this will necessarily devolve into faction because of the Entäußerung and the cracks that are caused by the universal will and the general will being composed of individual freedom. So because it's composed of individual freedom, factions are going to start to form once this general will splinters off. Because like, picture this, like the general will might be 51% of the population, so that leaves the other 49% to form their different faction. And now when he says that the unique work and deed of universal freedom becomes death, what he means by when he says universal freedom is the freedoms that are constituting the universal will or the government are now going to pursue death of the other base units of freedom, trying to undermine their universal will. And that's exactly what we see during the French Revolution when the Rousseauian groups, the Jacobins and later the Montagnards, or I guess the Montagnards, they start basically sentencing everybody to the guillotine and committing this huge reign of terror where they just killed a whole bunch of people who didn't agree with them. And so this is a great example where once these factions are created, people are excluded. And we have a second, more notorious instance of Entäußerung, which is what I was just alluding to, where once these freedoms who compose the universal will, supposedly, start to splinter off from it, they're going to experience a much harsher form of this Entäußerung, where they realize who they are in themselves, and they realize that they are in themselves a part of this general will, but self-consciously they're clearly not. And so we again have this notion of a consciousness, who somebody is, being starkly different from the role they're supposed to play. And this is what, to Hegel, is going to lead to the Reign of Terror. So in paragraph 592 and paragraph 593 of this section, Hegel is going to begin to do some interesting things where he is going to kind of equate freedom as Entäußerung, which is also kind of the absolute lord of death, or the absolute lord being death. So we're gonna talk about that, which is it's kind of a complex idea. But we'll start with the quote on paragraph 592. In itself, freedom is precisely this abstract self-consciousness that exterminates within itself all distinction. So freedom has to maintain a homogeneous nature in order to be truly free. So there can never be an instance of not free within a truly free individual. As a result, freedom, or the absolute lord, must exterminate anything not in accordance with its own nature to maintain its essence as freedom. So that's an interesting way of thinking about this, but so the universal will basically will look inside of itself and it'll say, well, these people here don't think they're free, right? So we have this splintering, this Entäußerung of these people who no longer think they're free. So in order for the universal will to truly be composed of the freedom of each individual, it must exterminate those who are not free to maintain itself as freedom. And so that to me is very that's pretty interesting, where it's basically the universal will has this self-reflective capability. And it's like, well, look at all these non-freedoms. If in fact I'm composed of only individual freedoms, I'm just going to kill all the non-freedoms, which which is interesting. That's what Hegel talks about when he refers to this absolute Lord being death, which is the way that the universal will can actualize itself or attempt to do so. So we move on to this next quote in paragraph 593 that says, "These consciousnesses that have felt the fear of their absolute Lord, death, submit again to the negation and distinction." So what he's saying now is, after you start eradicating some of these non-free consciousnesses or these voices of dissent from the general opinion, they are going to now alienate themselves from their own freedom. So they're going to kind of relinquish their freedom and go with the general will. They're going to subordinate themselves to the masses and return to partitioned and restricted work. Through this, however, they return to their substantial actuality. So what he's trying to say here is the consciousness encounters Entäußerung in a way to free themselves from their Lord death. It is through alienating themselves that the freedom that caused the creation of fractions, that they can become free from death. So they got to relinquish this freedom that created the factions in order to be free from death. So now it's not a freedom, the freedom they're achieving is not like a freedom to do as you please or a freedom to think what you want, but it's a freedom to be alive. So it's to be free from death. It's a freedom to not be killed in the reign of terror. It's having a membership in an opposing faction that death comes to freedom. Simply going along with the general will of the ruling faction. It loses freedom on the one hand, but it preserves it from death on the other. So when you just go along with this universal notion of freedom, I mean, the universal general will of the ruling class, you're not free, so to say. You're not free to do what you want, but you're free to live now. So that to me is an interesting couple of moves that Hegel is kind of making there logically, where he says, okay, the general will needs to purge itself of everything not free in order to be free, right? And so this Entäußerung that has led individuals to stray from the universal will is now going to become a target of attack for this ruling faction. And in order to maintain itself as the faction composed of all individual freedoms, it will kill those who don't think they're free, which is a pretty bold strategy. And the only way to escape this is for these these dissenting opinions to just go along with the general will. Sure, they still have Entäußerung insofar as, they might not internally believe what's going on here, but they're certainly not going to say anything. So they might still feel Entäußerung, and that they're like, well, my self-consciousness doesn't line up with this general will, but they suppress that. They at least don't show it. And I'm sure a lot of times they slip up and they get guillotined anyway. And in doing so, if they can somehow, suppress their own freedom and self-consciousness, they'll become free from death, if that makes sense. So they're free to live, but no longer free to think that they want. And so Hegel's kind of hinting here at various levels of freedom. So when he says things like, when we submit to this Lord death, we become free not to die, he's saying, yeah, you're free in one sense, but you're also still, experiencing this Entäußerung, and that you still probably don't agree with what's going on. However, it's that or die. So it's an interesting little argument that Hegel constructs here between paragraph 592 and paragraphs 593, and we'll elaborate more in the next couple of slides on some of these ideas. So now in the next portion, after Hegel kind of outlines the idea that men they're free to not die, but they're still experiencing this very, very strong form of Entäußerung, where they're not really allowed to have their subjective conscious feelings be in line with the general will. Otherwise, the general will, which is supposed to be composed of freedoms, will kill any dissenting opinion and enter the circle, because men are now being kind of ruled again by a very kind of paternalistic father, the father being their Lord death, or the threatening of killing them. So the dastardly circle, as Hegel puts it, is, out of this turmoil, spirit would have been hurled back to its starting point, to the ethical and real world of culture that has merely been restored and rejuvenated by the fear of the Lord that's returned to men's mind. So Hegel sees this kind of fear of the Lord as it kind of stabilizes things insofar as it maintains the world of culture, but now people are going to be stuck in this endless cycle. So it's clear that by submitting yourself to the rule of the leading faction, the spirit escapes death but undergoes Entäußerung to the extent that it is no longer free. This means that men will be in a constant circle of trying to actualize freedom only to end up alienating themselves to preserve their lives, meaning that there's going to be faction after faction, conflict after conflict, and what's going to end up happening is that there's always going to be this general will, and the general will, maybe it's the majority or just like the loudest voices, is going to look within itself and say, as we talked about, because I'm composed of freedom, I'm going to kill all the non-freedoms. And so all the non-freedoms are the voices of dissent. And so we're going to be stuck in this circle where men are kind of ruled by this Lord Death. And they're going to give up their freedom, experience this very, very harsh form of Entäußerung to be free from death, but still not free to think what they want. So the escape from the dastardly circle is going to lie in that very, very initial contradiction I hinted at where I said, oh, I really, really like this quote. It's going to lie in that. So in paragraph 594, we have, for consciousness, its immediate unity with the universal will and its requirement that it knows itself as this determinate point of the universal will is transformed into the exact opposite experience. So this freedom that formed the base unit of the universal will is going to become the exact opposite experience, i.e. that which destroys the universal will and kind of negates it. So we now see that the initial freedom that formed the foundational base unit to the universal will has been done away with. The freedom that caused the universal will to come into being has now become the freedom that was destroyed by the universal will. So freedom now knows that when it acts as freedom, it must be forced to either not be truly free or act as the negation to the universal will. Thus, this understanding that the Spirit has come to fundamentally alters the notion of universal will through the understanding of freedom that has been granted through self-consciousness. So now that freedom has come to a consciousness of itself as the base unit of the universal will, it's able to act as a negating force to the universal will. So it knows that when it's acting as freedom, it's either not going to be free or, insofar as it is free, negate the universal will. And it's once freedom comes to a conscious understanding of that the universal will doesn't really have a leg to stand on anymore. So the universal will and the governmental structures are no longer going to be able to propagate this basically Entäußerung and say, okay, every single freedom who's alienated from us, we're going to wipe it away. Because now the freedoms have come to a self-conscious, like, wait a minute, we create you. And so this kind of like internal negation that was initially held within the concept of universal will, being that the universal will of all is constituted by individual freedoms, once the individuals and the society come to a self-conscious understanding of that, as Hegel says it, the universal will is transformed into the exactly opposite experience, meaning that the will of the individuals is now given more power, and they're able to escape the Entäußerung and the reign of terror that was promulgated by the universal will trying to cleanse itself of all the dissenting freedoms. So to kind of tie up what we're talking about, the final way that we permanently escape from this dastardly circle is that on paragraph 594, the universal will is rather its pure knowing and willing is what it's going to turn into. And its universal will as this pure knowing and willing that does not lose itself therein and enter the dastardly circle. The quotes are kind of my interpretation here. For the pure knowing and willing are rather itself as the atom point of consciousness. So finally, the universal will is going to become this like pure knowing and willing, meaning that it's no longer going to kind of be this notion of Rousseauian general will, which is a will that looks inside of itself and finds a bunch of freedoms, and then those freedoms which don't align with the freedoms in control of the government, it kills those freedoms to be a freedom. What's going to instead happen is the universal will is going to realize itself that it is the atom point of consciousness. It is each and every one of these freedoms. And so that's where we're going to kind of be led to with Kant in these notions of like categorical imperatives, which lead us to these rational human things, not so much on the level of the Enlightenment and the will trying to exterminate all of the freedoms, but rather arguments based on freedom itself and man's capacity to have freedom in itself is where we're going to be led to. So now the universal will says, okay, well, I now realize everybody has freedom. Maybe these freedoms kind of conflict at some points, maybe it is, but there is kind of like almost like an ontological object called freedom that the universal will now realizes in its existence, and we can escape the circle. So we're not going to be thrown back into the whole thing where we go experience the reign of terror and the general will tries to purge itself from all dissenting freedoms. No longer is that. The freedoms are now going to be able to treat people as an end in themselves and not a mean. And that's more to come up on the next presentation, more than likely. So as will be discussed in the next presentation, the notion of a pure knowing and willing will lead us to a Kantian notion of morality. And I put Kantian in quotes because Hegel is going to diverge in very, very meaningful fashion from some of Kant's notions. And he's going to give a really good discussion of it. But much like he did with Rousseau, he kind of takes it and talks about it in his own terminology and frames things in, the broader aspects of society, then also how that society interacts with the individual. So we'll be seeing more of that as well. Because freedom has been so drastically revised during its encounter with the universal will, and freedom was itself the foundation of the universal will, pure knowing and willing on the conscious level will allow the universal will to accurately represent freedom without annihilating it. So like we said, the pure knowing and willing that happen on the conscious level of the human beings who possess freedom are going to now allow the universal will to accurately represent freedom without annihilating it, because all the individuals composed within this universal will now realize that it is in fact their ability to be a free individual that should govern their morals. And so more to come on that. Thanks everybody for watching the presentation, and that's it.